Destroy the papers. That's all the text said. 3 words from a father I hadn't spoken to in 15 years, arriving at 2 in the morning while I slept in my childhood bedroom. By the time I read it at dawn, my stepfather Richard was already in my room, fists clenched, demanding I hand over documents that could send him to prison for 20 years. What happened next would expose a conspiracy that stretched back decades and destroy the carefully constructed lies my family had built their fortune on. My name is Jessica Morgan, and this is how I learned that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who raised you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. At 34 years old, I had spent the better part of a decade building a reputation as one of Asheville's most respected estate planning attorneys. My specialty wasn't the glamorous courtroom drama you see on television. Instead, I worked in the quieter, more intricate world of wills, trusts, and the complicated mathematics of generational wealth transfer. I helped families navigate the emotional minefield of inheritance, mediated disputes before they became lawsuits, and ensured that a lifetime of work didn't evaporate in probate court. My office sat in a renovated tobacco warehouse in downtown Asheville, all exposed brick and reclaimed wood beams, with windows that overlooked the Blue Ridge Mountains. The view cost extra in rent, but it was worth it. Clients came to discuss mortality, and somehow those mountains made the conversation feel less frightening, more like a natural part of the landscape. Over the years, I'd handled estates ranging from modest family homes to multi-million-dollar portfolios. I'd seen every flavor of family dysfunction, every permutation of greed and grief that death and money could inspire. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd chosen this profession after watching my own family tear itself apart over exactly these issues. My grandfather, Thomas Morgan, had been a commercial real estate developer who'd turned Asheville's post-recession downtown revival into a personal fortune. While other developers chased quick profits in cookie-cutter suburbs, he'd invested in historic buildings, adaptive reuse projects, and mixed-use developments that actually improved the community. By the time he died last year at 87, his portfolio included 12 commercial properties, 4 residential buildings, and enough land on the outskirts of town to make him one of the county's largest private landowners. I'd been his favorite. Not because I flattered him or angled for inheritance, but because I'd been the only grandchild who seemed genuinely interested in his work. From age 12, I'd spent summers in his office, learning to read site plans and understand zoning regulations. He'd taught me that real estate wasn't just about money, it was about legacy, about shaping how a community grew. Those summers had inspired my career choice, though I'd chosen law over development. Grandpa Thomas had approved. "Someone needs to make sure these vultures don't steal everything when I'm gone," he'd said, not entirely joking. He'd been right to worry. My family had always been complicated, but his death had simplified the dynamics into something brutally clear. There were those who'd earned their place in his life, and those who'd married into proximity to his wealth. My stepfather Richard Thornton fell squarely into the latter category. Richard had entered our lives when I was 9 years old, shortly after my biological father Frank walked out. My mother Catherine, overwhelmed and financially insecure despite coming from money, had been easy prey for Richard's particular brand of charm. He was handsome in that country club way, all white teeth and golf tan, with a resume that sounded impressive if you didn't look too closely. He claimed to be a commercial property consultant, which mostly meant he networked at expensive restaurants and occasionally connected buyers with sellers for a modest finder's fee. What he actually excelled at was identifying wealthy women in vulnerable positions and making himself indispensable. My mother married him within a year. I'd protested at 10 years old, sensing something false in his constant affection, the way his smile never quite reached his eyes when no adults were watching. But Catherine was already pregnant with my half-brother Trevor, and my objections were dismissed as childish jealousy. Richard moved into our home, which my mother owned outright thanks to my grandfather, and immediately began the slow process of taking control. It started small. Suggesting my mother didn't need to work, that her modest interior design business was more stressful than profitable. Encouraging her to let him handle the finances, since he had experience with complex transactions. Gradually isolating her from friends he deemed negative influences. By the time I was in high school, my mother had become a shadow of herself, her creativity and independence suffocated by Richard's controlling presence. I'd escaped to college at 18 and never really came back. Oh, I visited for holidays, maintained the appearance of family unity, but I'd built my life deliberately separate from Richard's influence. I put myself through law school with scholarships, student loans, and part-time work, refusing Richard's offers of help that always came with invisible strings attached. My grandfather had been my true support, both emotionally and occasionally financially, though he'd been careful to make those gifts quietly, away from Richard's attention. When Grandpa Thomas was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 18 months ago, he'd asked me to handle his estate planning. It should have been straightforward. He knew exactly how he wanted his assets distributed, and he had the mental clarity to make those decisions stick. We spent months going over every detail, every property, every investment account. He was leaving the bulk of his estate to my mother, with substantial trusts for his grandchildren and specific bequests to several local charities. Richard wasn't mentioned at all. That's when things got complicated. My mother's inheritance was structured as a trust with me as the trustee, meaning Richard couldn't access or control it directly. Grandpa Thomas had been explicit about his reasoning. Catherine needs protection from her own generosity, he'd told me. And from Richard's ambitions. You'll make sure the money actually benefits her, not that parasite she married. I'd drafted the documents carefully, including provisions that would make them nearly impossible to contest. Grandpa Thomas signed everything in my office with 2 witnesses present, fully competent and clear about his intentions. He'd even recorded a video statement explaining his reasoning, insurance against any future claims of undue influence. When he died last March, I'd filed the will for probate, confident it would sail through without challenge. That confidence lasted exactly 3 weeks. Richard hired Brennan Associates, an aggressive litigation firm known for contesting estates, and filed objections claiming my grandfather had been mentally incompetent, that I'd exercised undue influence, and that an earlier will existed that was more favorable to the family. It was all nonsense, but it was expensive nonsense that would tie up the estate in court for years if we didn't fight back hard. Fighting back required the original documents, all of them. Not just the final will, but every draft, every piece of correspondence, every note from our planning sessions. I'd kept meticulous records, knowing Richard might try something like this. Everything was organized in bankers' boxes in my home office, backed up digitally, and copies stored in my law firm's secure files. Or at least, that's where everything had been until 2 weeks ago. My apartment had been broken into while I was in court. Nothing obvious was taken, no television or laptop, but my home office had been carefully searched. File drawers left slightly open, papers not quite returned to their original positions. The intruder had been looking for something specific, and I knew exactly what. My digital backups remained secure, encrypted and stored in the cloud, but the violation of my space left me shaken. I'd filed a police report, installed a better security system, and started keeping the most critical documents in the fireproof safe I'd purchased years ago for client files. The originals of Grandpa Thomas's will and trust documents now lived in that safe, along with something else I'd recently discovered. Evidence that Richard's objections to the will weren't just baseless legal maneuvering. They were part of a cover-up. 3 months before his death, Grandpa Thomas had given me a sealed envelope. If anything happens to me, he'd said, and Richard starts making noise about the estate, open this. Inside, I'd found copies of financial documents showing that Richard had been systematically stealing from my grandfather for years. Forged signatures on loan documents, fraudulent property transfers, embezzlement from several joint ventures they'd reluctantly partnered on. The evidence was damning, enough to send Richard to prison for decades. My grandfather had discovered the theft shortly before his cancer diagnosis. Rather than confront Richard immediately, he'd quietly gathered evidence while restructuring his estate to cut Richard out entirely. The plan had been to wait until after his death, when Richard couldn't manipulate my mother or destroy evidence, then turn everything over to prosecutors. Grandpa Thomas had trusted me to finish what he'd started. I'd been working with a forensic accountant, building an even stronger case before approaching the district attorney. We were close, maybe another 2 weeks from having everything documented and cross-referenced. Richard must have sensed the walls closing in, because the break-in at my apartment had happened right after I'd subpoenaed records from one of the shell companies he'd used for his fraudulent transactions. That's when my biological father Frank entered the picture. I hadn't heard from him in 15 years, not since he'd sent a birthday card with no return address when I turned 19. He'd been a rolling stone, charismatic and unreliable, who'd left my mother when the responsibilities of family overwhelmed his desire for freedom. I'd made peace with his absence years ago, understanding that some people simply weren't built for parenthood. His text message shattered that peace. The number was unknown, but the message identified him immediately. "It's your dad. Richard knows about the documents. He's coming for them. Destroy everything and disappear. I'm sorry I got you into this." I'd stared at my phone in the pre-dawn darkness of my childhood bedroom, trying to make sense of his warning. How did Frank know about the documents? Why would he be in contact with Richard? And what did he mean he got me into this? Then my bedroom door opened, and Richard stood silhouetted in the hallway light, his expression cold and determined in a way I'd never seen before. We'd always called it home, this sprawling colonial on 3 acres in Biltmore Forest, even though I'd moved out 16 years ago. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My mother still lived here with Richard and Trevor, my 24-year-old half-brother who'd never quite launched into independence. I'd been staying in my old bedroom for the past week while my apartment underwent fumigation after the break-in, though that was just the excuse I'd given. The real reason was that I wanted to keep an eye on my mother, who'd seemed increasingly anxious lately, jumping at sudden noises and making excuses whenever I suggested we spend time alone together. Richard didn't knock. That had always been his way, this casual violation of privacy disguised as family intimacy. "We don't need locked doors in this house," he'd always said, as if his authority extended into every private space. He stood in my doorway wearing golf clothes despite the early hour, and his face held an expression I'd seen him use on business associates he was about to intimidate. Cold calculation wrapped in a thin veneer of reasonableness. "We need to talk about your grandfather's estate," he said, stepping into my room without invitation. I sat up in bed, phone still in my hand with Frank's warning glowing on the screen. The coincidence of timing was too precise to be accidental. Somehow Richard knew that Frank had reached out, which meant they were in communication. The implications made my stomach turn. "It's 6 in the morning, Richard. This can wait until I'm dressed and we're downstairs like civilized people." He closed the door behind him, and that's when I noticed his hands. They were trembling slightly, not with fear but with barely controlled rage. I'd seen him angry before, usually at service workers or subordinates who couldn't fight back, but this was different. This was the fury of a trapped animal realizing the cage was locked. "Your father reached out to you, didn't he? Warned you I was coming." Richard moved closer to the bed, and I stood quickly, putting the mattress between us. Always so dramatic, Frank. Could have just handled this quietly, but he had to play the hero. I kept my voice steady, falling back on courtroom composure. "I don't know what you're talking about. And my father hasn't been in my life for 15 years. Why would he contact me now?" Richard laughed, harsh and mirthless. "Because I told him to. Because we had an arrangement, and he decided to develop a conscience at the worst possible time. Now I need those documents, Jessica. All of them. The originals, the copies, whatever evidence you think you've gathered. Hand them over and we can make this situation work for everyone." My mind raced, piecing together implications. Frank and Richard working together. An arrangement. That meant my biological father had been involved in Richard's scheme somehow, possibly for years. The betrayal cut deeper than I expected. I'd made peace with Frank's abandonment, but discovering he'd been actively participating in defrauding my grandfather, his own former father-in-law, added a dimension of cruelty I hadn't imagined him capable of. "There are no documents here," I said, which was technically true. Everything critical was in my apartment safe or my law office. "You're welcome to search my room if you'd like, but you won't find anything except old yearbooks and childhood memories." His jaw clenched. "Don't play games. Your grandfather left you evidence. I know he did because Frank helped him gather some of it, back before he understood the full situation. Then Frank got scared, realized he was implicated too, and we came to an understanding. He'd help me manage the problem, and I'd make sure his cooperation was rewarded. So you're admitting to fraud? I couldn't help the edge of satisfaction in my voice. You realize I'm an attorney, Richard. Everything you're saying right now is evidence. He took another step forward, and I moved back until I hit the wall beside my old dresser. Evidence requires witnesses, and there's no one here but family. That's always been your weakness, Jessica. You think the law protects you, that rules and procedures matter. But family operates outside those boundaries. Blood takes care of blood, or it destroys itself. His hand shot out faster than I expected, grabbing my wrist before I could reach for the door. The grip was painfully tight, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. I'd been patient with your little investigation, your forensic accountant, your careful documentation. I even let the break-in proceed peacefully, hoping you'd understand the message. But you're as stubborn as your grandfather, thinking you're smarter than everyone else. Let go of me. I tried to pull away, but his other hand caught my shoulder, slamming me back against the wall hard enough to rattle the framed photographs hanging there. My phone flew from my hand, skittering across the hardwood floor. This wasn't the Richard who played golf with city councilmen or charmed my mother's friends at dinner parties. This was someone I'd always suspected existed beneath the performance, someone capable of real violence when his interests were threatened. Those documents destroy everything I've built. They expose 20 years of work, of strategic positioning, of building a life that should have been mine from the start. Your mother was supposed to inherit everything eventually, and as her husband, I was supposed to manage it. But your grandfather was a vindictive old man who never accepted me, who wrote his will specifically to cut me out. I grabbed his wrist with my free hand, trying to break his grip, but he was stronger than his country club physique suggested. You stole from him for years. Forged his signature, embezzled from joint ventures, transferred properties into shell companies. The evidence is documented, dated, irrefutable. You belong in prison, not managing anyone's assets. His face flushed dark red, and I saw the calculation leave his eyes, replaced by pure rage. Prison? You think you're going to send me to prison? Everything I took, I earned. I spent 2 decades dealing with Thomas Morgan's condescension, his subtle insults, his constant reminders that I wasn't good enough for his daughter. I made this family work after Frank abandoned it. I raised you, provided for you, gave you opportunities your deadbeat father never could have. You didn't raise me. You occupied the same house while my grandfather actually shaped who I became. And the only thing you provided was a masterclass in manipulation and control. His hand moved from my shoulder to my throat, not squeezing but resting there with obvious threat. Where are the documents, Jessica? Last chance to do this the easy way. We can negotiate. I'll contest the will less aggressively, we'll reach a settlement that gives your mother access to some of the estate, and you destroy the evidence of my financial activities. Everyone gets something, and we move forward as a family. I met his eyes, seeing the desperation beneath the rage. He wasn't just angry, he was terrified. The life he'd built on fraud and manipulation was collapsing, and he was willing to do anything to shore it up. That made him unpredictable, dangerous in ways I hadn't fully appreciated until this moment. The documents are secure, I said quietly. Multiple locations, multiple copies, with instructions to be delivered to prosecutors if anything happens to me. You can threaten me all you want, Richard, but the evidence exists. It's already documented. The only question is whether you go down alone or drag Frank with you. Something flickered in his expression, calculation returning. He released my throat but kept hold of my wrist, thinking. Frank's already made his choice. He contacted you against my explicit instructions, which means he's trying to play both sides. Typical Frank, always looking for the exit that keeps him clean. But he's implicated in this too, deeper than you know. Those shell companies? He was a partner in 3 of them. Some of the fraudulent transfers? His signatures alongside mine. If I go down, he goes down. Then you're both going down. I twisted my wrist sharply, a self-defense move I'd learned years ago, and his grip broke. I dove for my phone, but he kicked it away, sending it sliding under the dresser. Then his fist caught my cheekbone, and pain exploded across the right side of my face. I stumbled, catching myself on the bed, tasting blood where my teeth had cut the inside of my mouth. "This is your last warning," he said, breathing hard. "I will not let some self-righteous child destroy what I've built. Your grandfather was a fool for trusting you, and you're a fool for thinking the legal system will protect you from family consequences. The documents, Jessica. Today. Or this gets much worse for everyone involved." He left without another word, pulling the door shut behind him. I stayed frozen for a moment, then scrambled under the dresser to retrieve my phone. My hands shook as I pulled up my messages, but Frank's warning text was gone. Deleted remotely somehow, which meant Richard had more technical capability than I'd given him credit for. Or Frank had been coerced into helping eliminate evidence. My face throbbed where Richard had hit me, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw the skin already darkening into what would be a spectacular bruise. Not the first time he'd been physical, I realized with sickening clarity. There had been other moments over the years, shoves that seemed accidental, grips that were too tight, his hand on the back of my neck during photographs that looked affectionate but felt controlling. I dismissed them as accidents or overreactions on my part, but now I saw the pattern. Richard had always been willing to use violence, just careful about when and where he deployed it. I needed to leave this house immediately. Not just for my safety, but because every moment I stayed gave Richard opportunity to escalate. But I also needed to document what had just happened, preserve evidence while details were fresh. I took photographs of my face from multiple angles, the finger-shaped bruises forming on my wrist, the scattered photographs that had fallen when he slammed me against the wall. Then I sat down and typed out everything that had happened, every word of our conversation I could remember, time-stamped and detailed. My mother's voice drifted up from downstairs, asking Richard if he wanted coffee. Her tone was carefully cheerful, the studied lightness of someone who'd learned to navigate dangerous moods through performed normalcy. How much did she know? Had she heard the confrontation in my room, or had years of trained deafness taught her to ignore sounds of violence? The woman who'd raised me felt like a stranger, someone I'd spent years trying to save who might be beyond saving. I dressed quickly, pulling on jeans and a sweater despite the June warmth, needing the psychological armor of being fully clothed. My cheek continued throbbing, and I considered going to the emergency room for documentation, but that would mean explanations, police reports, family drama exploding into public record. Richard was counting on exactly that hesitation, banking on my desire to handle things privately and professionally rather than making messy scenes. He'd miscalculated. What he didn't know was that I'd already been planning for this possibility. The break-in at my apartment hadn't scared me into hiding evidence, it had motivated me to accelerate my timeline. I'd met with my forensic accountant yesterday, finalizing the last pieces of our case against Richard. We had everything we needed, organized and cross-referenced, ready to present to prosecutors. I'd planned to do it next week, giving my mother one last chance to distance herself from Richard before the criminal charges landed. That timeline just accelerated to today. I grabbed my purse and laptop bag, moving quickly but quietly down the stairs. Richard was in the kitchen with my mother, both of them performing normalcy over coffee and newspapers as if he hadn't just assaulted me in my childhood bedroom. Trevor sat at the breakfast bar scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the undercurrents or perhaps deliberately ignoring them. "I'm heading out," I announced from the doorway. My mother looked up, and her expression shifted when she saw my face. "Sweetie, what happened to your cheek?" I walked into a door frame in the dark. "Clumsy." I kept my voice light, watching Richard's face for his reaction. He maintained perfect composure, sipping his coffee with studied casualness, but his eyes held a warning. We both understood the lie, the complicity it created, the precedent it set. "Be more careful," he said mildly. "Old houses have lots of unexpected obstacles. Wouldn't want you to get hurt." The threat was clear to both of us, wrapped in concern that my mother would interpret as genuine. I forced a smile and headed for the door, feeling his gaze follow me all the way to my car. Only when I was 3 blocks away did I let myself shake, adrenaline and delayed fear catching up with me. My phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. It was Frank. "Jessica, thank God you picked up." His voice sounded older than I remembered, rougher around the edges like he'd spent years shouting in loud bars or breathing cigarette smoke. "I haven't talked to you since you were 19. Why start now?" There was a pause filled with traffic noise. He was calling from somewhere public, maybe a gas station or rest stop. "Because Richard's about to do something stupid, and I can't let him drag you down with our mess." Our mess was his mess long before it became mine. I pulled into a coffee shop parking lot, needing to focus entirely on this conversation. My hands still trembled slightly from the confrontation with Richard, and my face ached where his fist had connected. Frank needed to understand exactly how far things had already gone. Richard already did something stupid. He came into my room this morning and assaulted me. Threatened me if I don't hand over evidence of his fraud. So whatever you're calling to warn me about, I'm already living it. "He hit you?" Frank's voice rose sharply. "Jesus, I told him to stay away from you, to let me handle the approach." "That wasn't part of our agreement." "Agreement?" The word made my stomach turn. "You made an agreement about how to manipulate me? About the best way to get me to destroy evidence that could send you both to prison?" I tried to keep the betrayal out of my voice, but it leaked through anyway. "This is the first time you've contacted me in 15 years, and it's to help your criminal partner intimidate your own daughter." "It's not like that." He sighed heavily, and I heard him walking, footsteps echoing like he'd moved into a stairwell or parking garage. "I got involved with Richard's schemes years ago, back when they seemed harmless. Moving money between accounts, creating paper companies for tax advantages, the kind of thing everyone does. I needed the money, Jess. I was broke, living in motels, and he offered me a way to make cash without actually working. I didn't know how deep it went until it was too late. You could have walked away. You could have told Grandpa Thomas what was happening. Instead, you helped Richard steal from him." I watched an elderly couple walk past my car, holding hands and laughing about something, and felt a sharp pang of envy for their uncomplicated affection. My family had never been simple, but I'd thought the complications were merely emotional. Discovering they were also criminal added a dimension of ugliness I wasn't prepared for. "Thomas knew," Frank said quietly. "At least some of it. That's why he cut me out of your life completely, made your mother choose between staying in touch with me or keeping his financial support. He knew I was working with Richard, and he wanted you protected from both of us. I thought he was being controlling, interfering in my relationship with my daughter. Now I realize he was trying to save you from exactly this situation." A minivan pulled into the space next to mine, and I watched a harried mother unload 3 small children, each one needing something different. Snacks, bathroom, permission to get a cookie. The ordinary chaos of family life, the kind I'd never experienced growing up and probably never would. My family specialized in more theatrical forms of dysfunction. If Grandpa knew you were involved, why didn't he turn you in? He had evidence on Richard. Why not include you in the prosecution? Because I'm still your father, and he knew how much that would hurt you. Frank's voice cracked slightly. He told me once, about 6 months before he died, that he'd kept my involvement quiet as a gift to you. So you wouldn't have to face the fact that both your fathers were criminals. He said one betrayal was enough for any child to carry. Tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them back. That sounded exactly like something Grandpa Thomas would do, sacrificing justice for my emotional well-being. It also explained why the evidence he'd left me focused entirely on Richard's activities, with only oblique references to unnamed partners. He'd protected Frank to protect me, even knowing it might compromise the case. "Richard doesn't know that you're shielded in the evidence," I said slowly, working through the implications. "He thinks if I turn everything over to prosecutors, you'll both go down. That's why he's been using you as leverage, making you think you're equally exposed. But you're not. The documents Grandpa left me don't mention you by name. You could testify against Richard and walk away clean." The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Frank spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "You're saying Thomas protected me even after everything I did? Even after I helped Richard steal from him for years? He could have destroyed me, should have destroyed me, but he chose mercy instead. He chose to protect me," I corrected. "You just benefited from that choice. But here's what you need to understand, Frank. I'm not my grandfather. I don't owe you protection, and I'm not interested in preserving your relationship with me at the cost of justice. If you want to avoid prosecution, you'll help me build a case against Richard. Full cooperation, complete testimony, every detail of every fraudulent transaction." "What about Richard?" "He'll know I betrayed him. Richard is going to prison whether you help or not. The question is whether you join him there or whether you finally do something decent and help hold him accountable." I waited, letting the choice crystallize. "My forensic accountant and I already have enough evidence to convict him. Your testimony would make it airtight, but it's not strictly necessary. You're the one who needs this deal, not me." Frank breathed heavily into the phone, and I could picture him in whatever anonymous location he'd chosen for this call, weighing his options. Self-preservation against loyalty to his partner in crime. The easy path of continued conspiracy against the harder road of finally telling the truth. If I testify against Richard, he'll retaliate. He's got connections, people who owe him favors. I've seen what happens to people who cross him. Then you should have thought about that before spending 20 years participating in his schemes, I said, my patience evaporating. I'm done being understanding about your choices, Frank. You abandoned me as a child, participated in defrauding my grandfather, and now you're calling to manipulate me into destroying evidence. The only reason I'm even offering you this chance is because Grandpa Thomas cared enough about my feelings to protect you. Don't waste his final gift." The coffee shop door opened, and I watched the mother from the minivan emerge with 3 hot chocolates balanced carefully in a carrier, her children trailing behind like ducklings. One of the kids dropped something, a small toy, and the mother patiently stopped to help retrieve it. Such ordinary kindness, the kind of patient parenting I'd never received from Frank or experienced in Richard's performance of family. "Okay," Frank said finally. "I'll do it. Full cooperation. But I need guarantees. Immunity, witness protection if necessary, some kind of assurance that Richard can't get to me. That's between you and the prosecutors. I'm meeting with them this afternoon. If you want to be part of that conversation, you need to be at the Buncombe County District Attorney's office at 2. Otherwise, I proceed with the case we've already built, and you take your chances." "I'll be there," he said. "Jessica, I know this doesn't fix anything between us. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness or even your time. But for what it's worth, I'm sorry. For leaving, for getting involved with Richard, for not being the father you needed. Your grandfather was right to cut me out of your life. You turned out better without me." The apology felt 25 years too late, but I appreciated the honesty of it. "Maybe we can talk about all that someday. After this is over, after Richard's dealt with, maybe we can have a conversation about what happened and why. But right now, I need you focused on testimony, on documentation, on building the strongest possible case. Can you do that?" "I can," he said. "I'll see you at 2. He hung up before I could respond, leaving me sitting in my car with a bruised face and the strange sensation of having just recruited my absent father as a witness against my stepfather. My family dynamics had always been complicated, but this reached new levels of dysfunction. I drove to my law office, needing the familiar space and the security of being surrounded by colleagues. My paralegal Adrian took one look at my face and immediately ushered me into my private office, closing the door behind us. "Who did that to you?" His voice was flat, the kind of controlled anger that came from someone who dealt with domestic violence cases and recognized the signs immediately. "Richard. This morning. He wanted me to destroy evidence in the estate case." I sat down heavily in my desk chair, suddenly exhausted despite the early hour. "Adrian, I need you to do several things very quickly. First, take photographs of my face and wrist from multiple angles. Professional documentation. Then pull every file we have on the Morgan estate, every piece of evidence about Richard's fraud. Make 3 copies of everything, store them in separate locations. He was already moving, pulling out his phone and adjusting lighting. You're going to the police. Not a question but a statement. District Attorney's office at 2. I'm bringing them everything, Richard's fraud, the assault this morning, all of it. My father's going to testify as a cooperating witness. Adrian paused mid-photograph. Your father? I thought he'd been out of the picture for years. He was. Now he's back, trying to save himself by turning on Richard. It's complicated, but right now I'll take testimony from anyone who can help put Richard away. The photographs took 15 minutes, Adrian's meticulous nature ensuring every bruise was captured from optimal angles with proper lighting and scale references. Then we spent 2 hours organizing documents, creating a prosecution package that told the complete story of Richard's fraudulent activities. Tax returns with forged signatures, property transfers that violated trust agreements, bank records showing systematic embezzlement, email communications that demonstrated deliberate intent to defraud. My forensic accountant Diane Chin arrived at 11, bringing her own detailed analysis of the financial crimes. She'd traced the money through multiple shell companies, identified patterns of fraud going back 18 years, and calculated total damages at just over $4 million. That's what Richard stole from your grandfather over 2 decades, she explained, walking me through spreadsheets that turned criminal behavior into clean numerical evidence. Some of it was sophisticated, using legitimate business structures for illegitimate purposes. But a lot of it was surprisingly sloppy, like he didn't think anyone would ever look closely. He didn't think anyone would look because he controlled access to the information, I said. Grandpa Thomas trusted him with financial details because he was married to Mom. Richard exploited that trust systematically. Diane nodded, flipping through pages of documentation. The good news is that the sloppiness makes our case stronger. Clear paper trails, obvious discrepancies, forged signatures that don't match exemplars. Any competent prosecutor can take this to a jury and win. At 1:30, I drove to the district attorney's office, Adrian accompanying me for support and as a witness to everything that had happened. The building was classic government architecture, all concrete and tinted glass, designed to project authority and permanence. I'd been here dozens of times for various legal matters, but never as a victim, never with my own assault to report. Frank was waiting in the lobby, looking exactly as I'd imagined he would. Older, grayer, wearing clothes that had seen better days but were clean and pressed. He stood when I entered, his expression uncertain, and I saw him register my bruised face with visible distress. He really hit you. It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. Frank's jaw tightened. Richard always had a temper, but I thought he kept it controlled around family. Guess I was wrong about that too. Assistant District Attorney Maria Santos met us in a conference room, accompanied by Detective Ryan Foster from the Financial Crimes Unit. I'd worked with Maria before on estate disputes that touched on criminal matters, and I respected her thorough approach and no-nonsense demeanor. She took one look at my face and immediately shifted into victim advocate mode, offering water and ensuring I was comfortable before we began. I spent the next 3 hours walking them through everything. The break-in at my apartment, Richard's threats this morning, the assault, and most importantly, the extensive evidence of financial fraud. Diane's analysis was spread across the conference table, and Maria studied it with growing interest while Detective Foster took detailed notes. This is substantial, Maria said finally. With this level of documentation, we can bring charges for forgery, embezzlement, wire fraud, and assault. The assault alone would be worth prosecuting, but combined with the financial crimes, we're looking at significant prison time. She turned to Frank, who'd been sitting quietly during my presentation. And you're willing to testify about your participation in these schemes? Frank nodded, his voice steady. I'll tell you everything. Every transaction, every forged document, every fraudulent transfer. Richard was the architect, but I was his assistant. I can give you details that will corroborate Ms. Chen's financial analysis and fill in gaps about how the schemes operated. Maria spent the next hour questioning Frank in detail, her legal training evident in how she systematically extracted information and cross-referenced it against the documentary evidence. Detective Foster occasionally interjected with clarifying questions, building a timeline of criminal activity that stretched back nearly 2 decades. Frank's answers were thorough, almost relieved, like someone finally unburdening themselves of secrets that had grown too heavy to carry alone. Richard started small, Frank explained, his hands folded on the table in front of him. A property transfer here, a signature there, always with some justification about tax efficiency or estate planning. He convinced Thomas that certain moves were financially prudent, and because Richard spoke the language of business, Thomas trusted him initially. By the time your grandfather realized something was wrong, Richard had already established patterns of access to accounts and documents. When did Thomas discover the fraud? Maria asked, taking notes in precise shorthand. Frank considered the question, his brow furrowed. About 3 years ago, maybe closer to 4. There was a property sale that didn't make sense, proceeds that should have gone to Thomas but somehow ended up in one of Richard's shell companies. Thomas started asking questions, hired his own accountant to review records. That's when Richard brought me in more actively, needed someone who could create paper trails that looked legitimate under scrutiny. I watched my father describe his crimes with clinical detachment, and part of me wondered if this was how he justified them to himself all along. Treating fraud as a technical challenge rather than a moral failure, focusing on methodology instead of consequences. It was easier to participate in destroying my grandfather's trust when you framed it as solving puzzles rather than stealing from family. Did Richard ever express concern about getting caught? Detective Foster leaned forward, his pen poised over his notepad. Always, Frank said. He was paranoid about Thomas discovering the full extent of the fraud. That's why he pushed so hard to be more involved in the estate planning, wanted to make sure he'd have access to everything after Thomas died. When Jessica was named as trustee instead of him, Richard completely panicked. Maria looked up from her notes. Panicked how? Specifically, what did he do? He immediately started planning to contest the will, Frank said. Found the most aggressive probate litigation firm he could, fed them theories about undue influence and incompetence. But more than that, he started looking for ways to discredit Jessica professionally. He reached out to former clients who'd had disputes with her, tried to gather ammunition about alleged mistakes or ethical violations. When that didn't work, he moved to more direct tactics. The break-in at my apartment, I said quietly. That was Richard's doing. Frank nodded, looking ashamed. He hired someone, a guy who does work for people who need things done quietly. The plan was to find the original documents and destroy them, make it look like a standard burglary. When that failed, he started considering more aggressive options. Aggressive like assaulting his stepdaughter? Maria's voice was sharp, and Frank flinched. I didn't know he was planning that. I swear, when I sent you that text this morning telling you to destroy the papers, it was because I thought if you complied, he'd back off. I didn't realize he was already in the house, already planning to confront you physically. If I'd known, would have called the police myself. Would you? The question came out harsher than I intended, but I didn't soften it. Because your track record suggests you prioritize self-preservation over protecting your daughter. You've known for years that Richard was dangerous, unstable, capable of violence. You participated in his schemes anyway. So forgive me if I'm skeptical about your sudden concern for my safety. The room fell silent. Maria and Detective Foster exchanged glances, recognizing the family dynamics at play but professional enough not to comment. Frank stared at his hands, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. You're right. I've failed you in every way that matters. I left when you were young, I enabled Richard's abuse of your family, I participated in crimes against your grandfather. There's no excuse for any of it. The only thing I can do now is tell the truth and hope it's enough to stop him from hurting you or anyone else. The vulnerability in his admission caught me off guard. I'd spent years building defenses against my father, against the hurt of his abandonment, and here he was finally acknowledging exactly what he'd done wrong. It didn't erase the damage or suddenly make him trustworthy, but it was more honesty than I'd ever received from him before. Maria redirected the conversation back to prosecutorial strategy. Based on what we've heard today, I'm prepared to move forward with multiple felony charges against Richard Thornton. The financial crimes alone warrant significant prison time, and the assault on Jessica adds another dimension. Detective Foster, I'll need you to coordinate with the white-collar crime unit and prepare arrest warrants. I want everything ready by tomorrow morning. What about Frank's immunity? I asked, needing clarity on his status. Maria looked at my father appraisingly. Given his cooperation and the fact that the primary evidence against him comes from his own testimony, I'm willing to offer a deal. Full immunity in exchange for complete cooperation through trial. He'll need to testify when we prosecute Richard, potentially face cross-examination from defense attorneys, and be available for any follow-up questions during the investigation. I'll do it, Frank said immediately. Whatever you need. Just tell me when and where to show up. The meeting wrapped up shortly after 4, with Maria promising to keep me informed as the investigation progressed. Detective Foster pulled me aside before I left, his expression concerned. Ms. Morgan, I want you to be careful over the next 24 hours. Once Richard realizes we're building a case against him, he may escalate. Do you have somewhere safe to stay, somewhere he doesn't have access to? I nodded, already planning to check into a hotel under an assumed name. My apartment, my office, and my mother's house were all compromised. I needed neutral territory where Richard couldn't find me until the arrest warrant was executed. Adrian had already researched secure locations, finding a small boutique hotel on the outskirts of town that didn't require identification verification for cash payments. Frank caught up with me in the parking lot, moving quickly despite his age. Jessica, wait. I turned, keys in hand, exhausted from hours of testimony and emotional processing. What, Frank? He hesitated, seeming to struggle with what he wanted to say. I know this doesn't change anything, but I want you to have my number. Not for me, but so you can reach out if Richard tries anything else. I'm staying at a motel off the highway, and I'll keep my phone on all night. If you need help, if you feel unsafe, call me. Why would I trust you to help? I asked, genuinely curious about his reasoning. Because I've already given the prosecutors everything, which means I have nothing left to lose by protecting you. And because despite being a terrible father, you're still my daughter. That has to count for something, even if it's just showing up when you're in danger. I took his number, saving it in my phone without comment. Then I drove to the boutique hotel, checked in under my middle name Harrison, and collapsed onto the bed in a room that smelled of lavender and fresh linens. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from my mother asking where I was, whether I was coming home for dinner, if everything was all right. I ignored them all, unable to face the complicated conversation about her husband's imminent arrest. Sleep was impossible despite my exhaustion. Every sound in the hallway made me jump, every car door in the parking lot sent adrenaline spiking through my system. I kept checking the locks on my door, verifying that the security chain was engaged, positioning a chair under the doorknob like I'd seen in movies. Rational thought told me Richard had no way of knowing where I was, but trauma doesn't respond to rationality. Around midnight, my phone rang. My mother's number. I almost didn't answer, but something in the persistence of the call made me pick up. Mom? Jessica, thank God. Her voice was strained, frightened in a way I hadn't heard since I was a child. Where are you? Richard came home furious, saying you'd gone to the police, that you were trying to destroy our family. He's been drinking, breaking things, and Trevor left to stay with friends because he couldn't handle the atmosphere. Is he threatening you? I was already pulling on shoes, ready to call the police if necessary. Not directly, but he's not himself. He keeps ranting about betrayal, about how he built everything and everyone wants to take it from him. Jessica, what's happening? What did you tell the police? I told them the truth, that Richard assaulted me this morning and has been defrauding Grandpa's estate for 20 years. I told them everything, Mom, and they're pressing charges. He's going to be arrested, probably tomorrow. The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. Then, in a small voice unlike her usual careful cheerfulness, she said, I knew. Not all of it, not the specifics, but I knew something was wrong. I've known for years that Richard was taking money he shouldn't, making transactions that Thomas wouldn't have approved. I just didn't want to see it clearly because admitting it meant my marriage was built on fraud. Mom, you need to leave the house tonight. Get a bag, take what you need, and go somewhere safe. If Richard's been drinking and he knows about the investigation, he's unpredictable. I can't, she said, but her voice wavered. This is my home. Where would I go? You can come here. I'm at the Mountain View Inn off Highway 74. Room 203. Come tonight, we'll figure everything else out tomorrow. But you can't stay in that house with him, not when he's in this state. Another long pause, filled with the sound of my mother's breathing and distant crashing from somewhere in her house. Richard destroying more property, taking out his rage on inanimate objects. Okay, she said finally. I'll pack a bag and leave when he's not paying attention. Give me an hour. I'll be there. The hour felt interminable. I paced the small hotel room, checking my phone every few minutes, imagining scenarios where Richard intercepted my mother before she could leave or convinced her to stay through some combination of charm and intimidation. The man was a master manipulator, and my mother had proven vulnerable to his tactics for over 2 decades. At 1:43, a knock on my door made me freeze. I approached cautiously, checking through the peephole before opening the chain lock. My mother stood in the hallway with a single suitcase, her face pale and eyes red from crying. I pulled her inside quickly, scanning the hallway to ensure Richard hadn't followed, then secured all the locks again. She sank onto the edge of the bed, clutching her purse like a lifeline. He didn't even notice me leaving. He's passed out on the couch surrounded by empty bourbon bottles and broken picture frames. I've never seen him like this, so completely unhinged. It's terrifying. That's who he really is, I said gently, sitting beside her. The charm, the country club persona, that was always performance. This rage, this entitlement, this is his authentic self when he's not getting what he wants. My mother turned to look at me, really look at me, seeming to register my bruised face for the first time. He did that to you this morning, didn't he? You didn't walk into a door frame. He hit you. I nodded, watching her process the violence her husband had inflicted on her daughter. The violence she'd chosen not to see through years of careful blindness. Her hand reached out tentatively to touch my cheek, and tears spilled down her face. I'm so sorry. I should have protected you. Should have left him years ago when I first suspected what he was. I chose comfort over your safety, and that's unforgivable. It's not about forgiveness right now, I said, covering her hand with mine. It's about making sure we're both safe and that Richard faces consequences for what he's done. Tomorrow, the police will arrest him. You'll need to decide whether you're going to stand by him through the prosecution or whether you're finally ready to choose yourself. She nodded slowly, exhaustion evident in every line of her face. I'm ready. I want a divorce. I want him out of my life completely. Whatever evidence you have against him, I won't fight it. And if the prosecutors need me to testify about anything I witnessed, I will. No more protecting him. No more pretending everything's fine when it's been broken for decades. We sat together in that hotel room until dawn, 2 women reclaiming agency after years of allowing Richard to dictate the terms of our lives. My mother told me things I'd never known, small moments of cruelty and control that she dismissed as normal marriage difficulties. I shared my own experiences, patterns of manipulation I'd only recognized in retrospect. Together, we assembled a fuller picture of who Richard Thornton really was beneath his polished exterior. At 7 a.m, Detective Foster called with news. Richard had been arrested at 6, taken into custody without incident despite being severely hungover. He'd immediately lawyered up, refusing to make any statements, but the evidence against him was strong enough that his silence wouldn't matter. Bail hearing was scheduled for that afternoon, and Maria intended to argue for remand based on flight risk and danger to witnesses. My mother and I attended the bail hearing together, sitting in the gallery while Richard stood before the judge in an orange jumpsuit that stripped away all his country club sophistication. He looked diminished somehow, smaller without his expensive clothes and practiced charm. His attorney argued for reasonable bail, citing his community ties and lack of criminal history. Maria countered with my assault, the break-in at my apartment, and evidence that Richard had been researching how to flee the country if charges were filed. The judge took less than 5 minutes to deny bail. Given the severity of the charges, the evidence of witness intimidation, and the defendant's apparent flight risk, I'm remanding Mr. Thornton to custody pending trial. Richard's face flushed dark red, and he turned to scan the courtroom, his eyes finding mine with cold fury. "This isn't over," he mouthed, but the bailiff was already leading him away. The trial began 4 months later on a crisp October morning when leaves were turning gold across the mountains surrounding Asheville. Richard had spent those months in county jail, his bail denied at every subsequent hearing as prosecutors built an increasingly comprehensive case. His legal team, initially confident about creating reasonable doubt, had grown quieter as the evidence accumulated. Financial records, testimony from former business associates, my own account of the assault, and crucially, Frank's detailed cooperation had created a prosecution narrative that was difficult to challenge. I sat in the courtroom every day, a visible reminder to the jury of Richard's violence. The bruise on my face had long since faded, but the photographs remained, blown up on poster boards and displayed during opening arguments. Maria Santos walked the jury through Richard's 2-decade campaign of fraud with methodical precision, starting with small improprieties and building to systematic embezzlement that had stolen millions from my grandfather. Frank testified on the third day, his discomfort obvious as he described his own participation in the schemes. Richard's attorney tried to discredit him during cross-examination, painting him as an unreliable criminal trying to save himself by betraying his partner. But Frank had prepared thoroughly, and his testimony remained consistent under pressure. He admitted his own guilt freely, never trying to minimize his role, which paradoxically made him more credible. This wasn't someone trying to dodge responsibility but someone finally telling the truth after years of deception. The most damaging testimony came from Richard himself. Against his attorney's advice, he insisted on taking the stand, convinced he could charm the jury the way he'd charmed business associates and social circles for years. But courtrooms don't respond to country club charisma, and Maria's cross-examination systematically dismantled his carefully constructed image. She walked him through each fraudulent transaction, each forged signature, each lie told to my grandfather. When Richard tried to justify his actions as family financial management, she produced documents showing he'd hidden proceeds in personal accounts rather than family trusts. Then Maria turned to the assault. She displayed the photographs of my bruised face and asked Richard to explain what had happened that morning. He tried to minimize it, claiming he'd merely grabbed my arm and I'd pulled away awkwardly, hitting my face on the doorframe in the process. Maria then played audio from my phone, a recording I'd made immediately after the assault while details were fresh. My voice described his fist connecting with my cheekbone, the taste of blood, his hand at my throat. The jury's expressions shifted from skeptical attention to visible disgust. Richard's composure finally cracked. He started ranting about family betrayal, about how ungrateful I was after everything he'd provided, about how my grandfather had poisoned me against him from childhood. The judge had to call a recess while Richard's attorney tried to calm him down. When court resumed, Richard was subdued but the damage was done. The jury had seen beneath his mask, glimpsed the entitled rage that drove his criminal behavior. Deliberations lasted 6 hours. The verdict was unanimous on all counts. Guilty of 23 separate fraud charges, guilty of assault, guilty of conspiracy to obstruct justice for the break-in at my apartment. Sentencing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, giving the judge time to review pre-sentencing reports and victim impact statements. I spent those 3 weeks preparing what I wanted to say. Not about revenge or punishment, though Richard certainly deserved both, but about the broader implications of his crimes. About how family relationships could be weaponized by manipulative people who understood that victims would hesitate to seek justice against relatives. About the particular vulnerability of trusting older adults whose cognitive decline made them targets for financial exploitation by people closest to them. The sentencing hearing drew significant media attention. Several reporters who'd covered the trial recognized it as emblematic of larger issues around elder financial abuse and domestic violence. Lindsay Parker from the Asheville Citizen had been particularly interested, seeing connections to other cases she'd investigated involving family members exploiting estate planning processes. Maria Santos requested the maximum sentence allowable under sentencing guidelines, arguing that Richard's crimes demonstrated sophisticated planning, abuse of a position of trust, and complete lack of remorse. His attorney pleaded for leniency, citing his age, lack of prior criminal record, and dependence of family members on his future earning potential. The argument rang hollow given that Richard's fraud had been the source of whatever wealth the family possessed. When the judge asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement, I stood and faced Richard directly for the first time since the trial began. He looked older, the months in jail having stripped away the veneer of vitality he'd maintained through expensive grooming and calculated charm. But his eyes still held that familiar calculation, already planning his next move, his next manipulation. Richard Thornton spent 25 years in my family, and for most of that time I believed his performance of being a devoted stepfather and husband. I thought the uneasiness I felt around him was my problem, my inability to accept my mother's choice of partner. Now I understand that instinct was recognizing something my young mind couldn't articulate. He saw my mother as an access point to my grandfather's wealth, saw me as an obstacle to be managed or eliminated. I paused, gathering my thoughts. The assault in my bedroom wasn't an isolated incident of lost temper. It was the logical culmination of years of escalating control and intimidation. When legal manipulation didn't work, when financial schemes were exposed, he resorted to physical violence because that's who he's always been beneath the charm. Someone who believes his desires matter more than other people's rights, safety, or autonomy. My grandfather spent decades building a legacy through honest work and community investment. Richard spent decades stealing that legacy while performing gratitude and family loyalty. The money he stole represented years of my grandfather's labor, opportunities he could have funded for his grandchildren, charitable works that would have benefited this community. Instead, it financed Richard's lifestyle and enabled his continued predation. I looked at the judge. What I'm asking for isn't revenge but protection. Protection for my mother, who's finally found the courage to leave after 25 years of manipulation. Protection for other potential victims who might encounter Richard in the future. And honestly, protection for Richard from himself, because without external constraints, he'll continue this pattern until someone gets seriously hurt or killed. The judge listened carefully, taking notes throughout my statement. Then she delivered her sentence. 22 years in federal prison for the fraud charges, to run consecutively with 3 years for the assault. Richard would be 73 when he completed his minimum sentence, assuming good behavior and parole eligibility. Effectively, she'd ended his life as he'd known it. Richard's reaction was predictable. He lunged toward me, held back by bailiffs as he screamed about injustice and family betrayal. The courtroom erupted in chaos before order was restored and Richard was removed, still shouting threats and accusations. My mother, sitting beside me, squeezed my hand tightly. She'd filed for divorce weeks earlier, and the proceedings were moving forward with Richard unable to contest from jail. The months following Richard's sentencing brought unexpected transformations. My mother enrolled in therapy, working through decades of enabling behavior and examining why she'd accepted control disguised as care. She reconnected with friends Richard had gradually isolated her from, resumed the interior design work she'd abandoned at his insistence, and slowly rebuilt an identity separate from her role as Richard's wife. Trevor, my half-brother, struggled more with Richard's imprisonment. He'd been Richard's favorite, raised to emulate his father's charm and entitlement, and the revelation of systematic criminality shattered his worldview. We had difficult conversations where I tried to help him understand that loving someone didn't require defending their crimes, that family loyalty had limits when confronting abuse. He eventually started his own therapy, beginning the hard work of separating his identity from his father's expectations. Frank remained in Asheville, working construction and attending addiction recovery meetings despite never having been an addict. He said the program's focus on making amends resonated with his need to address decades of harmful choices. We had coffee occasionally, awkward conversations where he asked about my life and I shared carefully curated details. Trust would take years to rebuild if it ever fully returned, but we'd established a baseline of honesty that hadn't existed before. The legal resolution of my grandfather's estate took another 8 months as Richard's fraudulent transactions were unwound and assets returned to proper ownership. Several properties had to be sold to recover money Richard had stolen and spent, but the bulk of the estate remained intact. My mother received her inheritance as originally planned, structured through the trust one managed to prevent future exploitation. She'd started using some of the funds to support local organizations serving domestic violence survivors, finding purpose in helping women escape situations similar to her own. I returned to my estate planning practice with renewed focus on protecting vulnerable clients from predatory family members. The publicity around Richard's case had brought inquiries from other families dealing with similar situations, people who'd suspected financial abuse but didn't know how to prove it or feared the consequences of confronting relatives. I developed protocols for documenting suspicious transactions, brought in forensic accountants earlier in the planning process, and created safeguards to prevent the kind of exploitation Richard had practiced for decades. Lindsay Parker approached me about turning the case into a longer investigative piece examining patterns of family financial crime. Through her research, we discovered Richard's scheme wasn't unique. Estate planning attorneys across the country reported similar cases of trusted family members exploiting access to aging relatives' finances. The difference was that most victims never received justice because families chose to handle matters privately rather than pursue criminal prosecution. We collaborated on a series of articles highlighting warning signs of elder financial abuse and resources for families dealing with these situations. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of people reached out sharing their own stories of relatives who'd stolen inheritances, forged documents, or manipulated vulnerable family members. Each story reinforced what I'd learned through prosecuting Richard. These crimes flourished in silence, protected by family loyalty and victims' reluctance to believe that people they loved could deliberately harm them. The publicity led to an invitation to testify before a state legislative committee examining elder abuse prevention. I spent an afternoon in Raleigh explaining how current laws failed to protect aging adults from financial exploitation by family members, how estate planning processes needed stronger safeguards, and how prosecutors needed better resources to pursue these cases. Several legislators seemed genuinely interested in reform, though I'd worked in law long enough to know that interest didn't always translate to action. More meaningful change came through the network of professionals I'd connected with during Richard's prosecution. Forensic accountants, estate attorneys, adult protective services workers, and prosecutors who specialized in financial crimes. We formed a regional task force focused on identifying and prosecuting family financial abuse, sharing information about suspicious patterns and coordinating responses across jurisdictions. Within a year, we'd assisted with 14 additional prosecutions, recovering millions in stolen assets for victims. My relationship with my mother evolved into something healthier than it had been in decades. Without Richard's influence distorting every interaction, we could finally talk honestly about our family history. She apologized repeatedly for not protecting me from Richard's control, for choosing her marriage over my safety. I reminded her that Richard had been a skilled manipulator, that recognizing abuse while you're experiencing it is infinitely harder than identifying it in retrospect. She told me things I hadn't known about her marriage. How Richard had monitored her spending, demanded explanations for every purchase, gradually convinced her that her own judgment couldn't be trusted. How he'd used my half-brother Trevor as leverage, threatening to turn him against her if she didn't comply with his demands. How she'd felt trapped between protecting her son and protecting her daughter, paralyzed by fear that any choice would cause irreparable harm. I learned that emotional abuse could be as devastating as physical violence, that control didn't require hitting someone to destroy their autonomy. My mother's experience helped me understand why she'd stayed so long, why she'd enabled Richard's behavior even as it harmed people she loved. She'd been a victim too, just in ways less visible than a bruised face or stolen inheritance. 2 years after Richard's sentencing, I attended his first parole hearing with my mother and Trevor. None of us spoke in his favor. Richard had prepared a statement about rehabilitation and remorse, but the parole board wasn't convinced. They noted his continued refusal to take full responsibility for his crimes, his attempts to minimize the harm he'd caused, and letters he'd sent to family members from prison that demonstrated ongoing manipulation attempts. Parole was denied. He'd be eligible again in 3 years. Walking out of that hearing, I felt lighter somehow. Not because Richard remained imprisoned, though that provided necessary safety, but because I'd finally closed a chapter of my life that had been written in fear and obligation. I'd spent decades trying to maintain relationships with people who saw me as an obstacle to exploit rather than a person to respect. Breaking those ties hadn't made me heartless. It had made me free. My practice continued thriving, built now on a reputation for aggressive protection of vulnerable clients rather than just technical expertise. People came to me specifically because they knew I'd fight for them against predatory relatives, that I understood personally what it meant to be targeted by family members who prioritized money over relationships. I hired 2 associates to handle the increasing caseload, training them to recognize warning signs and act decisively when suspicions arose. 3 years after the trial, I received a letter from Richard. It had been screened by prison officials and forwarded through my attorney to ensure no direct threats. In careful handwriting, he'd written several pages attempting to justify his actions and request my assistance in appealing his sentence. The letter demonstrated no genuine remorse, just sophisticated arguments about how his crimes should be understood as financial management rather than theft, how the assault had been a regrettable misunderstanding blown out of proportion. I read it once, then filed it away without responding. Richard was still performing, still believing that the right combination of words could manipulate his way out of consequences. Some people never changed, never developed the capacity for genuine self-reflection or accountability. My grandfather had understood that about Richard, which was why he'd structured his estate to minimize Richard's access. I'd simply finished what my grandfather started. Frank and I developed an unlikely alliance based on shared recognition of how badly we'd both been manipulated by Richard. He'd been a deadbeat father, but Richard had exploited that absence to position himself as my real parent while simultaneously resenting my existence. Understanding that dynamic didn't excuse Frank's failures, but it provided context. We'd both been damaged by Richard's presence in our lives, just in different ways. On what would have been my grandfather's 90th birthday, my mother and I visited his grave with flowers and stories about how we were using his legacy. The foundation she'd established with part of her inheritance had already helped 53 women escape financially abusive relationships. My practice had recovered over $8 million in stolen assets for victims of family financial crime. The real estate portfolio my grandfather built continued generating income that funded scholarships, community development projects, and preservation of historic properties. Richard had tried to steal that legacy, to redirect decades of work toward his own enrichment. Instead, his crimes had motivated us to ensure my grandfather's vision extended further than he'd imagined. Every woman helped through my mother's foundation, every vulnerable adult protected by improved estate planning practices, every successful prosecution of family financial abuse represented my grandfather's values outlasting Richard's greed. Standing at that grave, I thought about the text message that had started everything. Destroy the papers. 3 words from Frank that had seemed like a warning but had actually been a gift. Because I hadn't destroyed anything. I'd preserved evidence, demanded justice, and refused to let family loyalty silence truth. Those papers had exposed decades of crime and prevented future victimization. They'd given me the tools to break cycles of abuse that might otherwise have continued for another generation. My phone buzzed with a message from a new client, someone referred by a colleague who suspected their mother's caregiver was stealing from her. I scheduled a consultation for the following day, already planning how to investigate and document the suspected abuse. This was my purpose now, using my grandfather's legacy and Richard's crimes to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. The mountains surrounding Asheville glowed golden in the afternoon light, the same view my grandfather had loved from his office downtown. He'd built something meaningful in this community, something that outlasted him and would outlast all of us. Richard had tried to reduce that meaning to dollar signs, to treat legacy as something that could be stolen and spent. He'd been wrong. Real legacy lived in the lives you touched, the people you protected, the systems you changed to prevent harm. I drove home through streets my grandfather had helped develop, past buildings he'd restored, through neighborhoods he'd invested in when others saw only decline. Every brick and beam represented his belief that community mattered more than individual profit, that success meant lifting others rather than exploiting them. Richard had never understood that philosophy, could never see beyond his own immediate gratification. My apartment was quiet when I arrived, the security system I'd installed after the break-in showing no alerts. I'd made this space mine again, filled it with art from local galleries and furniture that reflected my taste rather than what family expected. Every choice was deliberate, every object selected because it brought me joy rather than because it performed success for others. I thought about Richard in his prison cell, still believing he'd been wronged, still convinced that his crimes were justifiable. Some people never learned, never grew beyond the entitled worldview that had shaped their choices. I'd wasted years trying to maintain relationships with people like that, believing that family obligation required accepting unacceptable behavior. My grandfather's final gift had been showing me that boundaries mattered more than blood relation, that protecting yourself from harm wasn't selfish but necessary. Those papers he'd left me, the evidence he'd carefully gathered, had been tools for building the life I deserved rather than the one Richard tried to impose. I'd used them well. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new families dealing with betrayal and exploitation, new opportunities to prevent harm. Tonight, I sat in my reclaimed space, surrounded by choices that reflected my values, and felt the satisfaction of having transformed trauma into purpose. Richard had tried to destroy me to protect his secrets. Instead, his violence had motivated me to destroy the silence that allowed predators like him to flourish. The papers survived. The truth emerged. Justice prevailed. And I built something beautiful from the wreckage of family dysfunction. That was legacy worth protecting. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If T has one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.